People filtering in and out, but we wanted to honor everyone who came on time. So, want to start doing intros?
Sure. And I'm Grace Kim. I will be co-presenting with Rebecca, and I am an architect here locally in Seattle. But I also serve as a board member for the National Co-Housing Association. And we're super excited to be here presenting at the conference because we think there are a lot of similarities and alignments between the two national organizations and the work that we're doing locally.
And another co-presenter who also wants to see the slides, but would you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Crystal Fisher. I'm with Community Home Trust. We're located in Carrboro, North Carolina, and we have facilitated some homes, 7 homes in Pacifica, which is a co-housing community there in Carrboro. One of 3 in Carrboro, in fact.
I'm Erica Malone. I'm with the National CLT Network. I'm the Director of Technical Assistance, and I'm here to forge further relationships on the national level between CLTs and co-housing groups.
And we'll also have joining us, oops, if I can get the slides to work, Greg Rosenberg, who is on the CLT network as well. He is floating right at this moment, but basically the structure of this session will be, we'll do a presentation for the first half, and then we'll ask the panelists to switch direction and face this way so that we can do a Q&A, and hopefully about half the session will be that, so we think that there will be lots of questions.
So where you're from and what you'd like to hear?
My name is Steve Keller. I'm from Sanford, Idaho, and we are hopefully starting the CLT. And I guess what I'm really interested in are the social aspects. When you get people living together, problems come up, and how does one deal with those?
Good question.
Jim Oldham. I'm with Equity Trust in Massachusetts, and we get a lot of calls from people who are interested in figuring out how to combine land and community in different ways, and so the more different ideas I can get, the better, and resources I can point people to.
I'm Craig Ragland. I'm the former executive director of COHO US and former board member, and I live at Songaya Co-Housing, which is here near Seattle, a very well-established community. And we're interested in what CLTs might offer the ongoing development we're doing.
Harry Hoffman with the Housing Development Consortium here in Seattle, and I'm just here because I'm a big fan of Rebecca and Grace.
We love that.
Let's jump to the front row here.
Sharon, you go ahead. My name is Emily Faden. I'm with the Housing Fund in Asheville, and I think I was just interested in seeing potentials for collaboration with the Housing Association.
I'm Katie Jo Flint from the Grand Forks Community Land Trust, and want to learn about co-op.
Can we jump back to you? Yep.
I'm Kaylee from Techno Modern, and we're in North Kansas. We've got 51 homes in trust and 50 rentals. We're just looking for better ways to grow.
My name's Edward, and I am with Proud.
We will try to address some of those topics. I'm not sure if we're going to get to specifically the financial one. I'm not sure if we'll be able to address that fully, but we're going to have a healthy chunk of time for Q&A. So what we do hope to cover in this presentation specifically is to answer to some of these questions. What is co-housing? So I'll give you some definitions and also talk about sort of the human side of things, why people choose to live in co-housing, so some of the benefits of living in co-housing. And then talk a lot about the physical design, because that's what everyone's really excited to talk about all the time. So as an architect, easy for me to do.
If you could hold your questions until the slide is over, we want to be able to get through this and then really have a robust conversation, because there's a lot of wisdom in this room. I'm very pleased about that.
Okay. And then future trends, so addressing the gentleman's concern about retirement planning. One of the trends is senior co-housing, so we'll talk about some of the other trends that we're seeing in the co-housing movement. And then I hope through conversation and maybe even some of the Rebecca sort of lobbing in some questions and some other ideas that we might address some of the similarities and differences with the CLT movement, and look at and we'll definitely be sharing some examples of partnerships that have occurred. So, and that was my prompt for doing the little check-in. So quickly, what is co-housing? There's lots of different definitions, and if you go to the cohousing.org website, you'll see the official definition. But the way that I describe it sort of on the grounds is that it's an intentional community where neighbors know and care about each other. And that while there is a strong emphasis on the community side of things, that there's a high value or high regard for privacy. So that'll come up in sort of unit design. And that, and I'm always amazed by the fact that I have to say this, but these are all fully equipped homes, meaning that everybody has a kitchen, dining room, bathroom, living room, whatever you have in your own home, and that is not a shared household or a shared whatever. And in this community, or this group, I can say it's not a commune. I try to avoid that word in other contexts because it only makes people think more that it's a commune. So the idea of co-housing started in Denmark in the late 60s with just a group of folks, including, I think, some teachers, social activists, architects, sitting around saying, wouldn't it be great if we could recreate the village, if every child could have 100 parents? And so there were lots of conversations and articles written, and basically it resulted in a group of people forming what was the start of the first communities. And those communities are now over 35, 40 years old at this point, and fairly robust. And the interesting thing in Denmark is that these communities largely were started off as rental communities, co-ops, and the first round, there were very few home ownership. In the US, that has evolved and it has become pretty much the norm rather than the exception, that co-housing is perceived as being a home ownership model for a very sort of limited segment of the population. So one of the reasons that Rebecca and I are here is to try to break open that preconception and try to change that conversation, and so that it's much more inclusive of income and ethnic diversity. So really quickly, the principles of co-housing is that there's easy for me to say, participatory process, and that's not only from the design standpoint, but also from a development and community building. It's a very much do-it-yourself sort of movement, and as of recent times, I would say like in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been more involvement from professionals, meaning architects, developers, the normal type of folk that are involved with development of projects, but there's still a very strong desire, preference for the residents, the future residents, to be deeply engaged with every aspect of the development process. The physical design focuses on pedestrians and sort of relegating the cars to the periphery of a project, and you'll see that in a few minutes. There's a significant amount of indoor and outdoor common area. You'll also see examples of that. And then resident management. So all of the property management, groundskeeping, teams that do the meal program, whatever needs to happen, finances, all that stuff happens within the residents, the community that is living in, or the people that are living in the community. They manage themselves. So, along the lines of the do-it-yourself or DIY culture, all of the work is being done by the residents. And there's also a non-hierarchical structure in that sort of governing process. So even though majority of co-housing communities are formed as homeowners or condos and have a homeowners association, in some cases those boards are sort of figureheads and sort of the people that you write on the piece of paper you turn into the state. I know in some cases the board is everybody that lives in the community, and it's really through usually a consensus decision-making process that all of the decisions for the community are made, and that's everybody involved and a very good process, and yet not the most fastest in terms of decision-making all the time. And I think this has become less of an issue these days, but it's something still to point out. There's no shared economy, meaning everybody that lives in a co-housing community has their own financial sort of ability. So it's not that there's a pooling of resources. This kind of goes back to the whole, the days when people got confused with co-housing and communes. There are examples of co-housing communities where there might be a few people that have a collective of, like a honey collective or a cheese co-op that they've started. So there's an idea of incubator businesses starting in co-housing, but that's not a general thrust or main part of co-housing. So I threw in this slide really quick just to show that there are, and this slide is old, it's outdated since it's '08, a census done in '08. There are currently about 120 built communities throughout North America, or throughout the US, and also a fair number up in, I'm trying to think of where to stand, in Canada, and there are probably about another 100 communities in the forming stage. And I'll talk about the fact that a lot of those are starting to become senior communities. But you'll see also in the slide that the concentration of communities is in California, specifically the Bay Area, because that's where the founders of the co-housing movement, two architects named Chuck Durrett and Katie McCammett, they were based out of the Oakland Bay Area, and so they started a lot of communities there. There's a great concentration in the Pacific Northwest here as well, and also in Boulder, and then sort of in the Northeast and around the Massachusetts, New England area. Okay, so why do people choose co-housing? What are the benefits? Co-housing is interesting in that it appeals to a lot of people in a lot of different life stages. So one of the things that I find the most intriguing is that it is predominantly a multi-generational model at this moment. But as I hinted, senior co-housing is becoming a really big idea and movement, and so I think that will start to change what the landscape of co-housing looks like. But I think it's a really rich model in terms of the support that people in all life stages might see and benefit from, and also the idea of giving and contributing, not only in your wage earning years, but also much longer into retirement and sort of eldership, a word that I learned from one of my elders. There's really strong community cohesion, meaning that people always talk about community and the need for it, and yet outside of the co-housing and even CLT and sort of broader community models, in the general sort of media, the talk about community, I feel like, is a very superficial level, and so it gets overused. And I feel like when you go to a co-housing community and you feel that palpable sense of community, I always feel like it's saying, and they mean it, because it is strong and it is really intimate. And I think the thing that I found to be really interesting is how that translates and plays out into this people and how they show up. So I see kids that live in co-housing being really able to communicate. They're not looking down at the ground when they're introduced by their parents to an adult. They know how to have conversations with other adults. They know how to play nice and use their words, which is a really great thing to see, especially as you think towards the future of our society. I also find that the adults are very self-aware and sort of aware of what their impacts are on the people around them and to the environment. And so I think it's a really healthy group of people that live in co-housing. Not to say that everybody is perfect, but I think there's just a general sense of everyone's working together and working on themselves and working to better society. So along those lines, I think that people that are in co-housing tend to be fairly involved, not only in their immediate community, but in their surrounding neighborhood. They tend to serve on PTAs, be involved on boards such as CLT boards. They're involved with lots of different things in the community. And because co-housers are organized, they also are looked at by the surrounding neighborhood as sort of the place to organize the greater community. If an issue is happening, and the co-housing communities often tend to be the meeting point for neighborhood block watches, or for I know at one community they were the hub for the tree counting and mapping for the greater neighborhood. So they're sort of the nexus for a lot of community events that happen there that are not necessarily sponsored by that co-housing community. So along those lines, I think that there's inherently built into co-housing. I heard sustainability used in a lot of different contexts, and I always think about it from the environmental side because I'm an architect, and that's a lot of what people talk about in my world. But it was great to hear this morning in one of the sessions, I think about with the Habitat for Humanity and CLT partnership, that there was talk about sustainability of the organizations and sort of that long-term, the longevity. I think that co-housing tends to have, the longevity of building social networks and the social contracts that are unstated but really, really strong. So in terms of social sustainability, I think about the resilience of communities in this market, in this economy, in this weird financial situation that we found ourselves in. the rate of foreclosure in co-housing as well as CLT is fairly low. And I have to imagine that there's something about the fact that when you're in community and you're open and able to have really intimate conversations with other people, you can be creative about the solutions that you come across. And a specific example related to foreclosure in that idea is, I know of a community where somebody had lost their job and was looking at possible foreclosure and trying to figure out how to get themselves out of this pickle, and having an open conversation with their neighbors. One of the neighbors said, "Hey, have you thought about the fact that you have this rental apartment downstairs? Why don't you move in there and find somebody to rent the house upstairs as a way so that you can stay in this community and so that you can stay afloat?" And I think that kind of conversation doesn't happen when you're isolated in a single family house and you don't want to share with your family or your friends this embarrassing situation that you might find yourself in. And when you're living in community, it's easier to have those conversations because people know where, you don't have to prove yourself or make any excuses. It's just who you are and where you are in your life, and folks are willing to help you think creatively. And I think because you're invested in your community, it's more than just losing a home. So I think the resilience is like I said, it's palpable when you go into communities. And then in terms of the economics, I think that one of the big things that I know is a struggle for CLTs looking at co-housing, or if you're in Habitat for Humanity or other organizations that are working with people of lower incomes, how do you maintain the economic sustainability of homeowner dues or just the long-term daily living of living in co-housing? That's something that I won't say that we've figured out yet, but I think from a daily living standpoint, there's potential for a lot lower cost of living in terms of, your home might be just the same price as living in a market rate house, but the benefit that you have on a daily basis in terms of maybe reduced water, utility bills, reduced grocery bills, things like that are pretty amazing. Okay, so I'm going to jump into physical design because this is what everyone wants to know about. So what makes co-housing unique? And when I talked about the 6 principles, I mentioned that the cars are relegated to the periphery. So this aerial is a great example to show that the cars are, out on the street and in this parking lot off to the periphery, and that the central part of the community is really designed for people. And so what that means is when there's families, the parents can, not that the kids can run free, because there's probably some guidelines in the community, but generally speaking, the kids can go out to play and you don't have to worry about them being run over or that a car might impact their playing or something like that. And so that's a pretty, I think, amazing thing about living in a community, all the kids sort of running around together in bands. What does that look like on the ground? So these are some examples of some suburban examples. The rural ones kind of fell off, but you'll see an example in a minute. And in urban settings, so to go back for a second, in a suburban or rural setting, they might be single-family detached homes, or they might be duplexes or townhouses side by side. In an urban situation, they're more multi-story, multi-unit developments, more like stacked flats and maybe townhomes as well. But there's also potentially a mixed-use or retail component to that. And you see a lot more adaptive reuse in the urban context. To get a little bit more sort of on the ground and looking at specific projects, Sangaya is the community that Craig lives in, and what I'm showing here is the site plan is actually just a couple acres of the 10 acres that they own, because the rest of it is used for farming, and I don't know if that's a
garden forest.
Okay, right. But is the farming as a team that is just doing food for the community, or is there?
Yes.
Okay, great. And Songaya is interesting in the fact that it's kind of a retrofit, a little bit in the fact that, oh, and I should note, every time you see a circle on one of my plans, it means that's where the common house is, because I'm very common house centric. So the common house was an existing building that's been renovated and adapted to serve as the common house. This structure here is sort of an old barn structure that is used for storage and a lot of different things like bikes and yard implements and things like that, as well as an amazing pantry, community pantry. They have a very robust meal program at Sangaya.
Where is this?
In Bothell, and Craig lives there, so it's just 30 minutes north of here,
And Craig, how many people live in Sangaya right now?
35.
in 13 units.
Yeah.
Or is it
13
14?
titled units, there's 15 actual homes.
Homes, okay.
And how often do you have meals, shared meals?
5 meals a week. But we're part of the 5% that is that extreme.
And what's your
So
average,
the normal is 2 or 3 meals per week in other communities.
what's your average cost per person per meal for those shared meals?
Well, there's a monthly cost of $120 that covers 5 meals a week plus use of the pantry.
So it's about $6.
That's for adults, it costs less for kids.
And,
Depends on how-
and the pantry is nothing to like, to turn your nose at. The pantry is, to be clear, is like a full-out stocked grocery store.
Yes.
You can go in and you could do shopping for a meal. You could get your pasta there, your sauce there, a variety of sort of, what is that
There's
word?
200 different food items.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I mean, it's
Almost all
literally,
ingredients rather than prepared food.
yeah, it's a full-out grocery store that you don't have to pay for. You just go in and just use whatever you want because you're part of the meal program. So it's a really, like I said, a really robust program. Okay, so another local model, Puget Ridge is also in Seattle and West Seattle. And this is 23 units on 2.5 acres. So similar size to what Sangaya has built on, but that's all the land that they own. It's in sort of a working class neighborhood in West Seattle, and has on the bottom of the slide here, this little fuzzy area or bubbled area is a wetland that they have to preserve and kind of maintain as part of the park system. And the common house is in the center here, sort of the focal point of sort of 2 sub-neighborhoods. This is considered, I remember, one is called the lower courtyard and the upper courtyard. And then this is sort of the valley, is what they call it. But this community is comprised of duplexes and triplexes. Again, the parking is sort of relegated to the side, and actually underneath these 2 structures, there's parking as well. And this community, there was an article just written in the Seattle Times Pacific Magazine, a really wonderful article that was written about this community. So if you're interested in that, I can give you the title of that.
What is it? What is it?
I'll look it up while you.
Okay, great. If you Google Seattle Times and Puget Ridge Co-housing, I'm sure you'll find the article, but she'll find it for you. And then Daybreak Co-housing is in Portland, Oregon, and I'm proud to say this is a community that I've designed. And it's a fairly urban community. It's on 2/3 of an acre, and it's 30 units. There is no on-site parking, so all of our parking got relegated to the streets that are surrounding it. It's surrounded on 3 sides by the city streets. And it's also located, there's a bus that stops at the corner right in front of their community, and light rail is 6 blocks away, and there's neighborhood commercial services on either side, either direction, within a couple blocks.
And that was a derelict motel that got.
It wasn't a motel, but it was, I think, 9 units. They were garden-style apartments, which are all over this neighborhood, and they're kind of, 40-year-old, 1-story wood structures that were all deconstructed. Actually, they were like, it was like watching a building being built, except in reverse. And a lot of those materials were either reused or sold at the Building Center in Portland. And I can tell you lots more, but I won't. Okay, so I'm not going to talk a lot about the private homes, except to say that community is at the heart of these co-housing communities, and that's sort of the thing that makes them really exciting, as opposed to living anywhere else in any other type of home. But in reality, the homes themselves are no different than any of the homes that you've been on, that you've lived in, that you've toured on home tours, that you might develop. They're all fully functional, independent homes. And the great thing about co-housing is it's great for both introverts and extroverts, because I've heard people say, oh, my husband is such an introvert, he would never live in co-housing. And actually, those are the couples that do great, because the wife, or whoever the extrovert is, I won't say it's always the wife, can get out in the community and have as much community daily as they want. And the spouse can just retreat to the home and be happy that their spouse is out there getting that fixed, and they don't have to do anything. And yet, over time, because the community has a chance to sort of build those bonds, those strangers are no longer strangers, and so it's easier for the introverts to actually engage. And I'm always amazed that some of the introverts become the folks that sign up to do the tours for the general public that come. I've met a few people that are that's their role in the community. I'm like, huh, interesting that this is what you chose. But again, the homes are very much like any sort of standard housing product. I've heard people use it that term that way, but literally it is like any other housing. I think it's really the intentionality of the people that live there that make co-housing. Okay, so like I said, I'm a common house nut. That's actually what my thesis in architecture school was when I went back and did a master's program much after my architectural school. And I focused specifically on the design of the common house, because as I was studying co-housing, I realized the homes are no different. So what is it really that makes co-housing unique? And it's really the intention to encourage community interactions in an informal way. And I think that all comes together in the common house. And it also is the place that facilitates the thing that I think makes co-housing unique, which is the meals. I think the communities that dine together the most are the ones that I feel that have the strongest community bonds. And I'm not going to say that that's 100% true, but I would say that generally speaking, when I go to visit a community, the ones where I feel like that palpable sense of, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff going on here, are usually the ones that have meals 3, 4, or 5 times a week. Not to say that it doesn't happen elsewhere, but that's sort of a general rule.
And we did a sociological survey of co-housing communities last year, and there was a direct correlation between the number of meals shared and the number of foreclosures. And the higher the number of meals shared per week, the lower the foreclosure rate. Which of course makes sense, but it was very nice to get that documented.
So I'm showing common houses, no matter where you are going to have a lot of different types of spaces and rooms. But the two that I think are sort of paramount to support this dining eating function is the dining room, one that's large enough that can hold at least 2/3 of the people of the residents all the time, and that can also accommodate everybody if in this sort of an expanded situation. So they need to be large enough to feel gracious and not cramped, and yet intimate enough that when you have just a few families there, that it doesn't feel cavernous. So it's a really tricky design consideration. And not one that always gets executed well. Kitchen design, again, with the interest of cooking for this many families. It could be on a given night that you're cooking from anywhere from 20 to 50 to 60 people, depending on the size of the community. And so to have a facility, whether it's a commercial kitchen or whether it's a very robust residential kitchen design, it just needs to accommodate lots of folks preparing and cleaning up. And I say lots of folks. In some communities, it's 2 people making meals for that large of a group, or it might be upwards to 3 or 4, depending on how social people want to be. But the benefit, I think, of co-housing, or this meal program, is that on a given night, I might pick up my daughter from school, come home, eat my dinner, and chat with my neighbors, and then go back home. And then I have a couple hours before bedtime to play with my daughter, do other things, do homework or whatever before bedtime. Whereas now, and I say that looking forward, I'm in a forming community now. My current pattern is rush home, pick up my daughter, quickly pull together a meal, eat dinner, get a bath, and then go to bed, and everyone's exhausted. So that's what I look forward to, and sort of relish in the shared meal part of co-housing. Generally speaking, there is a kids space, indoor playroom directly adjacent to or within sort of visual connection, maybe not audible connection, to the dining room. And that gives the kids a place to sort of release energy and be in close contact with their parents, so that maybe if there's a shrill shriek of danger that parents can hear, but otherwise that they're sort of not making noise in the common house. And then there's usually a lot of play spaces outdoors designed for kids. Common houses tend to, but don't always have a workshop, and it might be that this is a function that's elsewhere in the community in a separate structure. And it's great to see what communities don't purchase but show up. So I was at Puget Ridge the other day, and they had an amazing workshop, and they didn't buy a single piece of equipment, and they have like a drill press, a table saw, so many little cubbies for screws and bolts and little zip ties and whatever you might need, that most of the residents there don't ever think to go to the hardware store. They just go down to their workshop first to see what doodad they need. There's oftentimes built-in storage for individual storage, so that stuff doesn't show up on porches and cluttering homes. And another thing that I love about co-housing is community laundry. So most communities have in each of the homes a spot for a washer-dryer hookup. About half tend to use those, and then the other half tend to use the community laundry room, which might have 3 or 4 washers and dryers in a room. But the greatest thing is, and so for me, I like that, just going and doing all my laundry at once. But the greatest thing is that oftentimes you'll come in and you'll see like a row of baskets. And if you look carefully, you'll see like a row, the baskets will have either soap or instructions or something in there, so that if I get there at the start of the day, it's like, oh, there's 4 people ahead of me. I put mine in line, and then I go to the front of the line, move everything up, do whatever needs to be done, and then I push everything forward and I go home or go to work. And then at the end of the day, multiple people have done that. My laundry is done, and in some communities, my laundry is folded. So that's, I think, the beauty of sort of the community laundry. There's also central bulletin boards, meaning a central place to get information. So it might be where they post announcements, where the community, the internal mail happens, as well as the post office box. And many communities also have guest rooms, which is a nice bonus because many people that live in co-housing want to live in smaller homes. Like, you don't need to have the large dining room that you use once and the guest room that you have 3 visitors a year. So the guest rooms, I think, are a huge bonus benefit to the communities that have them.
And communities like hosting people with some notice and some relationships. So if you are interested in co-housing, you might consider starting in your local area first and seeing what is available for you to take a look at. And if you're traveling, give our office a call and I can help connect you with a community that, and you can stay for a night and see what the community's like. Join them for a meal and experience it.
And I think that the last part of what you said is key. I think just going and staying isn't enough. I think if you can try to figure out when their meals are, that's when you get to see the life of the community. So a bit of background on me, when I went back to graduate school and did work in, or sort of did research on my thesis, I went to Denmark for 2 years, or 2 months, actually it was years, 2 months, and I visited over 20 communities. And when I did those visits, I said, I'd like to come, I'd like to look at your common house, take photographs, measure, but more importantly, I'd like to help prepare a meal and eat with you guys. And that was always like met with silence because sometimes there was communication problems and them thinking that I was inviting myself to dinner at their home. But oftentimes it was just more stunned that, you want to come and eat with us? Like, why do you care about that? And yet that was how we learned the most about the communities. We would show up at like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, get handed an apron and a glass of wine, and we'd spend an hour and a half preparing a meal with folks. And in some cases, if we had asked for an interview with these folks, they would have never said anything to us because they were worried that, oh, my English is not so good or whatever. And yet when you're cooking and doing a simple task, it's just an easy way. It's kind of like breaking bread. It's an easy way just to have organic conversation. So I would say that that's the best way to sort of get to know some of these communities. And it's a way to endear yourself because nobody asks to help make a meal.
Work days.
Yeah, and work days. Yeah, and that's the beauty of these communities. It's not so much looking at the physical architecture. I mean, you can do that on any given day. If you want to get to know a community, it's really important to go when people are doing work together and how do people interact and what is the culture of the community like. So anyway, does physical design matter? I will say that it does. And not only because I'm an architect. I struggled a lot with this as I was doing my research. Is in that, having a bias that architecture always matters. I always try to take the stance that architecture doesn't matter and what is it really that it's facilitating. And so as I was having this, internal debate with myself, 2 communities that I visited in Denmark really helped illustrate this for me in a really concrete way. In Denmark, the model of co-housing sort of evolved over, I guess, 3 generations is what they call it, of co-housing, meaning like the first ones that were kind of the guinea pigs, the pioneers, and then it sort of evolved itself. And somewhere along the lines, there were a couple of revelations that were made. So I'm going to show you 2 projects that were designed within a couple years of each other by the same architect, and how the plan is very similar, and yet how 2 minor tweaks made a huge difference. So Trudland they're both L-shaped plans. And in this case, these buildings are set apart from each other. You can see photos on the right at the top and bottom of the pedestrian path. And it's a lovely landscape path, and you can access the community from both sides. And the common house there is shown on that middle slide. is elevated up to sort of signify importance, prominence of the common facility. Unfortunately, because it's up high, you can't actually see in. So if there's somebody cooking dinner in there, you can't see that. And if you happen to be running home and you've got your arms full of things, or your kids are, needing to go to the bathroom or whatever, you just fly by and you just go into your home. So I've heard that in the wintertime when it's, snowing and freezing out, and you live anywhere in the community, it doesn't matter if you're far or near, you have to put on your boots and your coat and get bundled up to go to the common house to eat meals. And so they reported that in the winter times, their meal programs dropped off significantly because people didn't participate. So fast forward a couple years, U-Strip was designed by the same architect. I think they must have had a revelation about this and said, okay, what if we bring the buildings closer together? So they squished this part closer. This is probably only like 15-ish, 18-ish feet. And then they covered it with sort of a greenhouse structure. So that was one minor tweak. And then this is the common house. And rather than elevating it up and doing a grade separation, they actually had the circulation. If you're walking in this path, you have to walk through to get to the other side. And so those two things allowed people to just, walk through. If you were parked down here and you needed to walk through, or if you just needed to go get something from a neighbor, you were always walking through the common house. And so you could always see if somebody was playing ping pong, or if somebody was making a meal, or, oh, there's my neighbor I forgot to ask this question of. There was this constant running into each other. And because it was all in, it's not human space, but in conditioned space, sort of, you could wear your slippers and not put on your coat and go to the common house meals, no matter what time of year it was. And so the vibrancy, granted this one's painted blue, so it looks much more vibrant. The vibrancy of the community was definitely palpable. Like, I could sense that there was an energy and life in the common area, in that street, that pedestrian street, that there didn't exist in the other community. So I thought that was a really good lesson of the importance of design. Okay, so I feel like I've been blabbing for a long time. I'm almost done. So trends in co-housing. I think senior co-housing, as boomers are trying to figure out what does my retirement look like, people are recognizing that, the traditional models that we've seen for the last 20, 30 years are not really what they want for themselves. And I think boomers tending to be sort of, do it myself and set my own destiny. I think co-housing is a really attractive model for this group. And Craig is actually in a forming group of a senior co-housing group that is sort of branching off of Sangaya. And there's lots of other groups that are starting and forming around that topic. And there's a great book, if you're interested, called Senior Co-Housing that the authors of the original co-housing book have written, and there's a study guide. There's a 10-session program that you can do with any group. And it was started by the Danish government as a way for people to plan for their eldership, or retirement, or whatever you want to call it. That's in the book, and I think it's a great starting point for conversation. Because even if you don't end up in co-housing, which is basically what the Danish government assumes, is that this is not a program for those that are interested in co-housing, but it turns out that half the folks that do this end up looking at co-housing as an option for their future, because it just makes a lot of sense. Along those lines, I think universal design is a trend that we're seeing in co-housing, and it's a trend that people are talking about in all sorts of communities and development, but I think as people are looking at the multi-generational aspect of things, the first round of co-housing communities in our country, to use Rebecca's word, were a bunch of young hippies trying to figure it out, and so they didn't really worry about when they were going to, get old or whatever. And so that has become a reality in some communities. Like, how do we navigate the site? How do we navigate our homes when we haven't thought about universal design? So that's something that we're definitely seeing a lot of conversation in co-housing. And historically, home ownership has been the model, or sort of the norm in co-housing, and new construction. And so one of the things that we're seeing more and more of, partly because of the current economic situation, but also just in wanting to increase affordability, is the idea of retrofits. So a retrofit community is one that either takes an old building and does adaptive reuse of that structure, and it might be just simply moving in and just occupying the building as sort of the retrofit, or it could be single-family homes in a suburban neighborhood that there are 2 or 3 that are for sale, and those get purchased, and then sort of more people assemble themselves. And there's a community in Sacramento called N Street Co-Housing that's been around for, I don't know how many years, probably a couple decades now, that started off in this model, and they occupy nearly a whole sort of suburban block. They just tore down all the fences in between and converted one of the homes into a common house. There's a more recent example in Lansing, East Lansing, Michigan, where it's a similar model in terms of there were a few homes in this neighborhood. They bought them and they started doing this, and the founder of this community describes the boundaries of their community as an amoeba, in that in order to join the community, you just need to live in you can only live no more than 4 homes away from the farthest edge of the community. So it's this thing that sort of grows organically, and they've sort of organized themselves around gardening and urban farming, sort of taking out driveways and putting in community gardens and things like that. And so organically and through their farming or their gardening, they've recruited folks that have lived in the neighborhood for years. There's a wonderful story of an African-American woman that's lived in the neighborhood for like 30 or 40 years. And when they were working in the yard one day, she said, "I don't know who all you folks are, but I love what you're doing to the neighborhood and I'm going to join you." She didn't know anything about co-housing, wasn't really interested in sort of what they were doing initially, but the fact that they were building community was really compelling to her. Along those lines, rentals are becoming more prevalent as well, partly in response to the economy and the fact that nobody can get mortgages, but also affordable housing developers are starting to look at this as a potential model. And that's one of the things as board members and as the association we're really excited about, is the opportunity to expand the definition of co-housing and see how other organizations, developers, the CLT movement can adopt it and adapt it to their uses, so that it's not this pure sort of model that is only addressing the needs of one segment of the population. We think there's benefits to larger groups. And so we know that rental works because it works in other countries. So we as Americans have a very high bias towards homeownership, and we're trying to help break that model. Other trends are related to mixed use and development in urban neighborhoods around transit. Those are 2 things that HUD and EPA and DOT had a national grant out this last year called Sustainable Communities. And when I looked at the letter of the intent of that, it was like co-housing would be perfect for this. And so I know that there are some communities that are already in those types of neighborhoods, but as there's more funding available for those urban transit-rich neighborhoods, I think co-housing can become part of that model, whether it's an affordable housing developer incorporating some of those ideas, or a community just kind of trying to take advantage of some of those funding opportunities there. Okay, I thought I was done, but I'm not. I'm almost done. So strategically, a few years ago, the board said, we want to make co-housing a household word. And we kind of were joking when we said that, but it has sort of led to, by saying it out loud, it has led to interesting paths. And 2 of those areas that I'm most excited about are the work that we've been doing in the last couple of years, trying to increase affordability and just increase the awareness of the need for that. And so as an association, we have said structurally we're going to start looking at and tackling how can we increase affordability, because the communities themselves, while they were interested in it, they weren't able to do it. And we're recognizing that partnerships is the way to do that. So I won't go into all the things that we're doing, but that's one of the big things. And then looking at ethnic and racial diversity. I remember one of the first community or co-housing conferences I went to during at the very end sort of Q&A and check-in session. There was a lot of self-flagellation of the participants saying, how come we're looking around and this is a mostly white audience, and why are we not attracting people of color and people of diverse incomes? So we're going to stop that self-flagellation and do something about it and try to really tackle this problem as an association. So those are 2 things that I'm really excited about that we're working on at the national level. And we're also looking at broadening the model from just traditional homeownership to the other forms that I mentioned. Okay, so some emerging partnerships that we're excited about. We've been talking with AARP. There's a lot of interest there from what the senior co-housing model might afford folks, seniors that are their members. We've been talking with the Congress for New Urbanism. Local housing authorities are starting to pay attention. And then, through conversations like this, as well as some of the community interest participation that we've had, and likewise, Habitat for Humanity, they have homes in some of our communities nationwide, but there's not been a really concerted effort to incorporate those affiliates. So we're going to be doing a lot more in the upcoming year to try to build that bridge. So here's a couple of examples of communities that have used the CLT model. to help fund some of the homes or to underwrite some of the mortgages. And Troy Gardens actually is a community that Greg Rosenberg's been involved with and helped develop. And he developed the whole project as a CLT project. So all of the homes in that community have underwritten their land costs.
Now, on behalf of the network, I'd really like to thank Grace and Rebecca and